The wind that swept across the prairie carried with it a hush of secrets, the kind that made the heart beat a little faster, as though it sensed something hidden just beyond sight. The horizon stretched endlessly, painted in muted shades of gold and grey, where dawn struggled to rise and night lingered stubbornly. Against this backdrop rode a lone figure, his horse slow and weary, his shadow long across the brittle grass. His name was Caleb, a man marked by scars both seen and unseen, who had lost almost everything: his family, his comrades, his faith in the promise of tomorrow. And yet, despite the sorrow carved into his bones, destiny had not abandoned him. Fate had drawn him here to this forgotten land where silence clung to every fence post and sorrow bled through every rotting beam. He had come because of a letter, a simple will left by an uncle he barely remembered, offering him not just a ranch, but a final chance at redemption. He believed this would be the place to lay down his burdens, to breathe in peace and healing, to mend a soul that had been broken for too long. But the land was not as it seemed, and from the moment his boots touched its soil, it whispered of mysteries far darker than he could imagine. The air was heavy with the scent of earth after rain, though no rain had fallen in weeks. Caleb dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel path, and paused at the sight of the farmhouse, windows boarded, the porch sagging like an old man's spine, every plank groaning with memories best left buried. The place was desolate, but in its emptiness there was a strange pull, as if something was waiting for him behind its silent walls. He brushed the dust from his coat, exhaling slowly, his grey eyes scanning every inch of the property. Somewhere deep inside, hope flickered faintly, though he barely trusted it. He thought of his wife's laughter, the soft touch of his little girl's hand, memories that once crushed him, now echoing like gentle ghosts meant to guide him forward. This ranch, for all its ruin, offered the smallest promise, that he could rebuild, not just the house and fences, but the fragments of his heart. As he walked toward the barn, a place that should have carried the familiar scent of hay and horses, the air shifted. A shiver traced his spine. The hinges screamed when he pushed the door open, and what lay inside was no simple inheritance. It was a secret the land had been holding tight, a truth that stole the breath from his chest and made his heart thunder with dread and sorrow all at once. What he saw would change everything, every hope, every quiet dream he had nurtured on his long journey here. For within those dark shadows, the beginning of a new story awaited him, one carved in both pain and healing, one that would test his strength and his capacity for love. Though Caleb did not yet know it, this discovery would entwine his fate with another's, weaving two broken paths into a single thread of light. It was here, in this fragile place between despair and hope, that a romance unlike any other would be born. A bond tender as the first rays of dawn and unyielding as the prairie wind. And if you find yourself drawn into this tale, carried by its warmth and yearning, I invite you to stay, to share your thoughts in the comments, to like and subscribe, so that together we may continue unfolding stories of love, courage, and healing beneath these endless skies. The prairie waited, hushed and watchful, as Caleb's hand hovered at the edge of the barn door. Beyond it lay not only shadows, but the first step into a destiny he could not escape, a destiny that was about to reveal itself with the force of a storm. And as the faint light slipped through the cracks, he felt it, the beginning of something that would both shatter and mend him, carrying him into the arms of love he never thought he would find again. The door groaned open wider, and the sight that met Caleb's eyes was unlike anything he had ever seen. Not even the blood-soaked fields of war had prepared him for this. From the rafters of the barn, 8 delicate figures hung in cruel silence, their feet bare and swollen, their skin bruised by the ropes that bound their throats. They swayed slightly in the draught that slipped through the cracks, like fragile blossoms torn from the earth and suspended in a merciless wind. For a heartbeat, he thought them lost to death's embrace. But then, as if the land itself refused to let despair win, a faint sound stirred the air. A low moan, thin as the breath of morning, brushed against his ears. His chest tightened. They were alive. At least one of them still clung to life. Caleb's heart hammered, his fingers trembling against the handle of his hunting knife. Memories of his daughter's fever came rushing back. The way her eyes had pleaded for help, the way her tiny body had burned in his arms as he whispered prayers that went unanswered. That night he had been powerless, but here, now, he could act. He would not let these young souls slip away into the void without a fight. His boots pounded across the wooden floor, echoing like thunder in the barn's hollow belly. He leapt to the first rope, the knife slicing clean through the coarse fibers. The girl fell heavily into his arms, cold as river stone, her lashes fluttering as though caught between worlds. He lowered her gently, his voice low and steady, whispering words of comfort she could not understand but might somehow feel. One by one he cut them down, each drop stealing the strength from his limbs, but igniting a deeper fire in his heart. The air grew thick with dust and desperation, his sweat dripping into his eyes, but he pressed on. Each frail body that collapsed into his embrace reminded him that healing sometimes began in the smallest acts, the warmth of touch, the simple refusal to abandon. When at last the final rope gave way, and all 8 lay upon the straw-strewn floor, Caleb staggered, chest heaving, vision blurred by exhaustion. But he saw life stirring, faint yet undeniable. A cough rattled through one throat. A hand twitched. Eyes blinked open, glimmering with fear and gratitude all at once. Gathering them in his arms, he carried each one out of the shadows and into the sunlight. The prairie's morning light wrapped around them like a gentle blessing, warm and healing, as though nature itself wished to keep them alive. Their skin, pale and bruised, drank in the fragile rays, their breaths growing steadier. Caleb's knees buckled beneath the weight, but he did not falter. He laid them upon the dry earth, whispering softly, his voice no longer the voice of a soldier, but of a father, of a man learning to love again by choosing mercy over despair. When he returned for the last girl, her lips quivered with a whisper. The words were fractured, broken between 2 tongues, yet they reached him like a plea from the heart. "Please, do not leave. Stay, just for tonight." Her cracked eyes met his, and something inside him broke open like a wound that longed to heal. He nodded, though she could not know his promise, and drew her close against the strength of his chest. With great effort he carried them to the cabin, the old wooden shelter that smelled of mildew and time, but whose roof still held against the wind. Inside he built a fire, coaxing flames from dry splinters, each spark a quiet prayer. The warmth licked against their trembling forms, casting a golden glow across faces too young to bear such torment. He brought water to their lips, drop by drop, until the harsh coughs softened into sighs. Their eyes opened slowly, wide and dark, reflecting the light of the fire and the silent devotion of the man who refused to abandon them. Caleb sat among them, his hands raw and bloodied, yet his soul stirred by something gentler than he had known in years. Here, in this broken cabin, surrounded by 8 fragile lives clinging to breath, he felt a flicker of purpose rise within him. It was not yet love, not yet trust, but it was the beginning of something warmer, something that soothed the cold ache he had carried alone for so long. He could not explain why fate had placed these lives in his care, but he understood one truth with clarity. From the moment he cut the first rope, his path had changed forever. The fire crackled softly, like the heartbeat of hope, and outside the wind swept across the open plains. He watched over them as they dozed fitfully, their breaths shallow but present, his weary body refusing rest. Beyond the cabin walls, the land lay in silence, but Caleb knew silence never lasted. Trouble would come. He could feel it in his bones. Yet for this night, beneath the fragile warmth of firelight, surrounded by lives that now depended on him, he allowed himself the smallest piece of peace. It was a moment of healing, tender and fleeting, yet powerful enough to carry him into the next dawn, where shadows and destiny waited to test him once again. The night deepened with a quiet weight, the kind of silence that made every flicker of the fire seem louder, every shift of the wind against the cabin walls sharper. Caleb sat with his back to the logs, the rifle across his knees, though he did not look at it. His gaze was fixed on the circle of fragile forms huddled around the flames, their breaths unsteady, their skins still bearing the angry marks of rope burns. Some stirred in restless dreams, hands twitching as though still fighting invisible bonds, while others lay as still as statues, faces pale, yet softened by the warmth of the fire. He leaned forward, coaxing the fire higher, and in its glow he studied them with a heart that was no longer hardened by grief, but pulled open by an ache he could not name. The eldest among them began to stir, pushing herself up slowly with trembling arms, her dark eyes locked onto him, wary and watchful, as if she carried not only her own suffering, but the weight of all those around her. When she finally spoke, her words were broken, her voice low, but the meaning pierced through the barriers of language. "You, why help?" The question, simple and unadorned, struck deeper than any accusation. Caleb lowered his gaze to his hands, still raw with rope fibers, still trembling from the effort of saving them. He remembered the feverish hand of his daughter clinging to him years ago, her eyes begging for more life than fate allowed. His chest tightened, and when he raised his eyes again to meet the girl's, his answer was steady, though hoarse. "Because I cannot watch eyes beg for help and do nothing." The words settled into the room like a prayer. For a long moment, the crackle of the fire was the only sound, but the eldest girl's eyes softened just slightly, as if a wall had cracked. She gave the faintest nod, small yet powerful, a gesture that felt like the first thread tying 2 distant worlds together. The others stirred at her side, whispering in their own tongue, some too weak to move, some leaning against one another, as if the bond between them was the only strength they had left. Caleb rose and fetched what little water remained in the bucket, kneeling down to offer it carefully. One girl clutched the bowl as though it were life itself, drinking greedily before coughing into his shoulder, yet her eyes shone with gratitude. Another turned away, refusing, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. He did not press her. He simply placed the bowl beside her, a silent promise that choice was still hers. The cabin, once a hollow shelter of rot and mildew, now pulsed with fragile life. In the flickering glow, Caleb felt the weight of his own loneliness loosening just a little. Healing was not always grand. It was here, in these tiny acts, in the patience of offering water, in the quiet of watching over strangers whose pain mirrored his own. His grief no longer felt like a closed wound, but like something tender, beginning to breathe again. Hours passed, and though exhaustion gnawed at his body, he did not sleep. He listened instead to the rhythms of their breaths, to the sighs and coughs, to the fragile heartbeat of survival. Each sound tethered him more firmly to the present, to this cabin, to the lives he had saved. He realized then that this inheritance was not just a ranch. It was a choice, a calling he had never expected but could no longer deny. These girls were no longer shadows on a rope. They were living, breathing reminders that his own life still carried meaning beyond sorrow. Outside, the prairie groaned with restless wind, rattling the cabin door. Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle, instinct sharpening, for he knew peace could never last long on this land. Yet when he looked back at the faint glow of eyes that had trusted him enough to close in sleep, he felt something steady bloom inside his chest. For the first time in years, the emptiness was not absolute. Something, fragile, uncertain, but real, had begun to heal him, and though the storm was surely coming, he was ready to stand. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows across the walls, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Caleb's heart, scarred but no longer hollow, beat with new resolve as the first hints of dawn whispered at the edges of the horizon, promising that destiny was far from finished with him or those now bound to his care. Dawn crept across the prairie with a tenderness that felt almost fragile, its pale light spilling into the cabin and painting the weary faces of those who had endured the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but its warmth still lingered, soft and healing, wrapping the room in a hushed embrace. Caleb, though his body begged for rest, had not closed his eyes. He had watched over them, each breath of theirs a quiet promise that life, once nearly stolen, had chosen to stay. The lines of exhaustion carved into his face could not mask the strange serenity in his chest, a calm born from knowing that his presence here mattered. The girls stirred one by one, blinking against the light. Their voices, faint and broken, rose in whispers of a language Caleb could not fully understand, yet he felt the meaning all the same. Fear still lived in their eyes, but there was something else now, fragile as morning dew, a trust beginning to bloom. The eldest sat upright, her movements careful, as though her body fought against both pain and pride. She studied him with eyes dark as earth, filled with questions and warnings, but touched too by a spark that softened the edge. She placed a hand to her throat where the rope burns still marked her skin, then looked at him as if measuring his soul. Caleb reached for an old shirt and tore it into strips, his calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness. He knelt before her, the distance between them closing in silence, and began wrapping the makeshift bandage around the raw wound at her neck. At first she flinched, her body tense with memory, but his touch was steady, careful, almost reverent. His voice, low and rough, yet carrying warmth, broke the stillness. No more ropes. Only healing now. She could not understand all his words, but she felt them, and slowly her body eased beneath his care. He moved from one girl to the next, binding their wounds, offering water, letting them rest their heads against his shoulder if they grew faint. With each act of quiet tenderness, the cabin shifted. It no longer felt like a place of decay, but like a sanctuary, fragile yet alive. The youngest clung to his sleeve, her tiny fingers trembling, and though no words passed between them, her wide eyes spoke volumes. Caleb's heart clenched. He had once carried his daughter in just such a way, her small hand gripping his shirt as she struggled for breath. That memory, once unbearable, no longer crushed him with despair. Instead, it mingled with this moment, softening the edges of his grief, transforming it into something gentler, something healing. Perhaps this was what fate intended, that through saving them, he might find his own salvation. As the sun climbed higher, golden light streaming through the gaps in the walls, the world outside stirred restlessly. The sound of distant hooves echoed faintly, carried on the wind like a warning. Caleb stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped by the door. The eldest girl noticed too, her head turned sharply, her eyes narrowing with recognition and fear. She whispered urgently to the others, and their bodies tensed, their fragile calm shattering into trembling unease. Though Caleb could not grasp the full meaning of their words, he understood one truth: danger was coming. He rose to his feet, his tall frame casting a shadow across the girls huddled close to the fire. The rifle felt heavy in his grip, not just as a weapon, but as a burden he could no longer lay down. He glanced back at them, their bruised faces, their fragile trust, the unspoken bond tying their survival to his own, and knew there was no turning away. He had thought this land would give him solitude, a place to disappear into silence. Instead, it had placed him in the heart of a storm. The girl's eyes followed him, wide and uncertain, yet in their gaze was something that steadied him. They had chosen to believe in him, at least enough to cling to life by his fire. That belief gave him strength. He stepped to the doorway, the morning light sharp against his face, and peered out toward the horizon. Dust rose faintly in the distance, a sign of riders approaching, and the wind carried with it the unmistakable rhythm of hooves, steady as a heartbeat that promised confrontation. Inside the cabin, the girls whispered in fear, their voices trembling. But Caleb lifted his head, his jaw set with quiet resolve. The healing warmth of the fire still lingered behind him, the memory of their fragile trust still steady in his chest. Whatever came from the horizon, he would not abandon them. His life, once marked by loss and wandering, now had purpose, and though shadows gathered, he was ready to face them. The prairie wind howled louder, rattling the door as if warning of the storm about to break. Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle and turned back once more to the girls. His eyes met the eldest's, and in that moment no words were needed. She understood his vow as surely as he understood the quiet fire burning in her gaze. Together they braced for what was to come, as the first distant flicker of torches pierced the horizon, marking the arrival of destiny. The sound of hooves grew louder, beating against the earth like war drums, steady and unyielding. The cabin's frail walls quivered under the force of approaching riders, and in the firelight the girls clutched one another, their fear spilling into the air like smoke. Caleb stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, his breath steady though his heart pounded. He had faced armies before, storms of bullets and screams, but this was different. He was not protecting soldiers or land, but fragile lives who had barely escaped death's grasp. Behind him, their trust was fragile yet whole, a healing thread binding his wounded soul to theirs. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, he saw torches burning against the horizon, their flames stretching like a fiery serpent across the dark prairie. Dust churned beneath the riders' horses, their silhouettes rising until they filled the night with power and fury. The circle formed quickly, more than 60 Apache warriors surrounding the cabin, their faces fierce, their weapons gleaming. The air grew thick with tension, every breath heavy with the promise of blood. One arrow struck the ground before the porch, quivering in the dry soil, a warning that no man could ignore. Caleb's hands tightened on his rifle, sweat tracing the line of his temple. He glanced back at the girls huddled together, their eyes wide, their lips trembling with words he could not understand, but whose meaning was written in their terror. One of them whispered frantically in her native tongue, pointing toward the riders with urgency. The eldest pushed herself upright, her strength fragile, yet unbroken. She walked to Caleb, placing her thin hand against his chest to steady him, her eyes blazing with resolve. "You saved us," her broken English faltered. "Now, let us save you." Her words, fractured but strong, struck him deeper than any blade could. Outside, the warriors' cries rose, demanding what they believed was theirs. A tall young man rode forward, his bow drawn, his voice cutting through the night. "Return them! Every man who touched my sister must pay in blood." The circle of fire tightened, shadows of horses and spears dancing across the cabin walls like living spirits. Caleb lifted his rifle, his voice hoarse but unshaken. "I saved them. I did not harm them." His words echoed, swallowed quickly by the night. But behind him, the eldest girl staggered forward, her bruised throat bared for all to see. She cried out in her native tongue, her voice fierce, and then turned back to Caleb, forcing the broken words into English. "Not him. Different white man. Morrison." The name fell heavy into the night, like a stone striking still water. The circle stirred, warriors growling, whispers breaking through the ranks. The chief himself rode forward, his presence filling the air with weight. His face bore the scars of battles long past, his cloak heavy with feathers and honor. He reined in his horse before the cabin, his dark eyes piercing into Caleb's soul. "White man," his voice rolled like thunder, "what have you done to my daughter?" Silence gripped the air, the firelight catching the sheen of every drawn arrow, every spear poised to strike. Caleb's breath caught, but his eyes did not waver. He thought of the ropes he had cut, of the desperate coughs that had answered life's call, of the whispered plea, "Please do not leave." His voice was raw but steady. "I saved them. If I had come any later, they would be gone." For a moment, only the fire cracked. Then the eldest girl stumbled from the cabin, her voice ringing out in Apache, her hand trembling as she pointed to the wounds around her neck. Her words poured forth, halting and broken, yet carrying truth like fire in the dark. She told them of Morrison, the land baron, who had ordered them strung in the rafters to sow hatred and fear, to set tribe against settler, to burn the valley into his possession. The circle erupted in fury, not at Caleb, but at the revelation. Spears lifted to the sky, cries of rage bursting through the night. The chief's gaze burned with doubt, but when he looked into his daughter's eyes, something shifted. His hand fell slowly, and in that gesture the bows lowered. The suffocating weight of death eased just slightly, though the warning in his voice remained sharp. You are not the enemy, but know this: by saving them, you have bound yourself to a war without end. Caleb exhaled, the rifle lowering just enough, though his shoulders still bore the heaviness of fate. The girls, no longer merely victims, stood behind him, their eyes glowing with fragile strength. They had spoken for him, defended him, and in their voices he found a healing bond deeper than words. For the first time in years, he did not stand alone. The prairie wind howled around them, carrying sparks of fire and the echoes of hooves, but within the fragile circle of trust that had formed between him, the girls, and their people, there was something stronger than fear. It was the promise of survival, of love, waiting to grow in the shadows of despair. The chief's warning hung in the air like a prophecy, and Caleb felt it settle into his bones. He knew then that his life would never again be one of solitude, that this broken ranch had tied his destiny to theirs. As the tribe withdrew into the darkness, leaving only silence and the smouldering torches behind, Caleb stepped back into the cabin. The girls looked up at him, their breaths still uneven, their eyes a mixture of relief and dread. He set the rifle down, sat among them once more, and let the fire warm his face. In their presence, his heart, once nothing but ashes, stirred with the fragile flame of hope. Outside, the land lay quiet, but the horizon glowed faintly red, as though the earth itself knew another storm was already on its way. The night after the war party's departure was heavy with silence, as though the prairie itself held its breath. Caleb sat on the porch of the cabin, the Winchester laid across his knees, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the last torchlight had vanished. The girls rested inside, curled together around the fire like fragile birds sheltering from a storm, their breathing steadier now, though haunted by dreams that woke them in trembling starts. He should have been weary enough to collapse, but his body refused to rest. The words of the chief still rang in his mind. You have bound yourself to a war without end. He had not sought war. He had come here for peace, for healing, for a chance to lay his ghosts to rest. And yet, as he looked back at the faint glow of the fire through the cracks of the cabin, he knew he would choose this path again and again, if it meant protecting them. The dawn came crimson, washing the valley in streaks of fire, as though the sky itself had bled during the night. Caleb moved through the yard, fixing what he could, the sagging fence posts, the scattered ashes of torches, the brittle remnants of rope that still clung to the barn door. Each task steadied his mind, anchoring him in a rhythm that felt almost like prayer. The girls watched him quietly from the cabin doorway, their eyes following his every movement. When he paused, one of the younger ones stepped forward timidly, carrying a small bundle of kindling. She set it at his feet, her dark eyes shy but determined. Caleb bent, brushed the dust from her hands, and smiled faintly. She flinched at first, but then a small warmth flickered across her lips, a fragile smile that healed something deep within him. Inside, the eldest continued to grow stronger. Her voice carried more weight each day, and though the language between them was broken, they found ways to speak, in gestures, in looks, in the unspoken trust that lingered in silence. At night, when the wind rattled the cabin walls, she sat across from him by the fire, her eyes steady on his. It was not yet love, not yet anything as tender as that, but something deeper was building, a recognition, a bond forged not by chance, but by suffering endured and mercy given. Caleb found himself drawn to her presence, not only because she was the voice of the others, but because her strength reminded him of the woman he had lost, and yet was wholly her own. The healing was slow, fragile, and filled with setbacks. Some nights the girls woke screaming, clutching their throats as if the noose still choked them. Caleb would rush to their side, his rough hands awkward but gentle as he soothed them, whispering words he once used to comfort his daughter. His voice, low and warm, carried no magic, but it was enough to bring them back from the edge of panic. The eldest often stayed awake with him, her gaze softening each time she saw the way he bent his strength toward care rather than violence. It was in these moments, hushed and tender, that something new began to grow between them, not born of desire, but of healing, a fragile love that promised to mend what had been shattered. But peace is a fleeting thing on the prairie. The next night, as the girls finally found a deeper sleep, and Caleb leaned against the wooden wall with his eyes closing for the first time in days, the sound of hooves returned. This time they did not come from the hills where the Apache had vanished, but from the road that cut through the valley toward town. Harsh laughter pierced the darkness, carried on the wind like poison. Caleb rose instantly, rifle in hand, his heart cold with recognition. Torches flared once more, but these did not belong to warriors seeking justice. They burned with greed and malice, wielded by men who had never fought for honor, but only for land and power. At their head rode Morrison, his bloated form draped in black, his voice booming with arrogance as he shouted across the night, "Caleb Stratton, this land is mine. The will was a lie. The game is over. I'll burn you and your worthless ranch to ash." His words were met with roars from the gunmen at his side. They hurled torches onto the dry fences, and flames leapt instantly, devouring the brittle wood, casting the sky in a furious glow. The girls inside the cabin awoke with cries of terror as smoke drifted into the cracks. Caleb shouted for them to stay low, his voice sharp with urgency, but his hands were steady as he braced his rifle against his shoulder. The first shot cracked through the night, dropping one of Morrison's men before he could hurl another torch. Gunfire answered, tearing into the walls of the cabin, splinters flying like rain. The yard erupted into chaos, fire, bullets, smoke, and screams blending into a storm that threatened to swallow them whole. Caleb dove to the ground, firing with deadly precision, each shot driven not by rage but by resolve. This was no longer about land. This was about the fragile lives inside the cabin, the trust they had given him, the healing that had only just begun. And as the flames rose higher, silhouetting Morrison's twisted grin, Caleb felt the weight of his choice settle fully upon him. He was no longer a man seeking solitude. He was a protector, a shield, a heart willing to burn in order to keep others alive. The prairie wind howled through the inferno, carrying with it the sound of hooves. Another storm rising from the hills, fierce and relentless. Caleb's eyes lifted toward the horizon, and he knew the battle was far from over. What came next would test not only his strength, but the fragile bond of love and trust beginning to grow in the ashes of despair. Gunfire ripped through the night like a storm unchained, bullets shattering wood, sparks leaping from burning fences, the crack of rifles blending with the cries of frightened horses. Caleb pressed himself against the ground, his rifle tight in his grip, each shot a measured act of defiance against the advancing line of Morrison's men. Smoke curled into the air, thick and suffocating, yet through its haze he could still hear the trembling cries of the girls inside the cabin, their voices breaking the night with fear that seared him deeper than any wound. He shouted for them to stay low, his tone steady, though his chest burned with the weight of urgency. Every fiber of his being was consumed not by rage, but by the fierce will to shield them, to keep the fragile healing they had begun from being destroyed by greed's fire. Morrison rode at the front, his massive form swaying on the saddle, eyes gleaming with the cruelty of a man drunk on his own power. His voice cut through the roar of flames, mocking, taunting, claiming the land as his, claiming Caleb's life as forfeit. But Caleb did not answer with words. He answered with fire. His shots fell men from their saddles, torches slipping from their hands, sputtering out in the dirt. Still they came, wave after wave, rifles blazing, their shadows merging with the inferno, until it seemed as if the very night had turned against him. The cabin groaned beneath the assault, boards splintering, holes torn open, yet still it stood, sheltering the lives within. Caleb fought with the quiet ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. And then, through the chaos, another sound rose, a cry that split the smoke like thunder rolling down from the mountains. Over 50 Apache riders burst from the darkness, their bows drawn, their lances gleaming in the firelight. Their war cries shook the ground itself, and for a moment the tide of battle shifted. Morrison's men faltered, their confidence fractured as arrows rained down with deadly precision, striking through the smoke, cutting men from their saddles, sending horses screaming into the blaze. The prairie that had seemed ready to devour Caleb now became an ally, carrying the fury of riders who would not let lies and cruelty stand. Caleb surged forward from the dirt, his rifle empty, his knife flashing in his hand. He moved through the chaos with a focus honed in years of war, but sharpened now by purpose. This was not killing for survival. This was standing for the innocent, fighting so that those who had suffered enough might see another dawn. Flames roared around him, the air choked with the scent of gunpowder and blood, yet in his chest there burned something purer than vengeance. With every strike, every breath, he was no longer the wandering ghost who had come here to vanish. He was alive, fiercely, painfully alive, bound to the fragile lives that had chosen to trust him. Morrison, bellowing with rage, tried to rally his men, but fear had already taken root. His horse reared beneath him as he attempted to retreat, his cloak snapping like wings of shadow. An arrow flew swift as lightning, striking deep into his back. His scream echoed once before he toppled from the saddle, his body swallowed by fire and dust. The sight broke the last of his followers, who scattered into the darkness, leaving behind only the ruin they had wrought. Slowly, painfully, the storm of violence ebbed, leaving silence broken only by the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded. Caleb stood in the wreckage, his knife dripping, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion but unbroken. Around him, the Apache dismounted, their eyes sharp but no longer filled with wrath for him. Their chief, silent and grave, looked at him as though weighing not his strength, but the weight of his heart. Then his gaze shifted to the girls emerging from the cabin, their faces pale, yet alight with gratitude. They rushed to Caleb's side, their trembling hands reaching for him, and in their eyes he saw what no victory could ever give, a healing warmth that wrapped itself around the broken pieces of his soul. The eldest stepped forward, her voice hoarse, her throat still scarred, yet her words steady. She spoke to her people, her tone fierce, her hand pointing to Caleb not as an enemy, but as a shield, a man who had stood when others sought to destroy. Her declaration rippled through the gathered riders, and slowly the circle of suspicion loosened into one of acknowledgement. Chief Tacona inclined his head, a gesture heavy with meaning, before turning away into the shadows with his warriors. They left behind not mistrust, but a bond sealed in fire and blood. The ranch smoldered, fences broken, earth scarred, yet the cabin still stood, sheltering the fragile miracle of survival. Caleb lowered his head, the knife falling from his grip, and sank to his knees in the dirt. The eldest knelt beside him, her hand brushing his arm, her gaze filled with quiet strength. No words passed, but in that touch lay a promise, that healing was not just for them, but for him as well, that love could grow even in a place haunted by ashes. The firelight flickered against their faces, warm and tender, as the prairie wind carried away the last echoes of battle and whispered of a new dawn yet to come. The battle's echoes faded into the wide silence of the prairie, leaving behind only the crackle of dying flames and the soft murmur of the wind weaving through broken fences. Smoke hung low, veiling the stars, yet above the haze the sky stretched infinite, patient, unchanging, as though it had witnessed such storms before and knew that healing must follow ruin. Caleb stood amidst the ashes, his boots sunk deep in scorched earth, the weight of his knife slipping from his hand at last. His body trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the sheer force of survival. The ranch, once promised to him as a place of peace, now lay scarred and blackened, but within that ruin something more enduring had taken root, a bond born in fire, a love neither sought nor expected, but undeniable in its quiet power. The 8 girls stepped from the cabin, their figures fragile against the glow of the smouldering night. They moved like shadows transformed into light, no longer the phantoms that had swayed from ropes, but survivors, eyes lifted toward life again. The youngest clung to her sister's hand, her small fingers clutching with a determination that defied her trembling body. The eldest walked at their front, her throat still bandaged, her strength fragile yet unbroken. She looked at Caleb with eyes that carried both gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken but alive. He met her gaze, and for a moment the world grew still, the chaos of fire and battle retreating into silence, leaving only 2 souls recognizing each other across the vast space of loss and healing. He stepped toward them, his movements slow, reverent, as though he feared breaking the fragile spell that held them together. The eldest did not draw back. Instead, she let him close the distance, her eyes steady, her breathing uneven but filled with resolve. His calloused hand, once only accustomed to war and emptiness, lifted hesitantly before brushing against hers. The touch was brief, tender, a question more than an answer, Yet in that contact he felt something stir, a pulse of life rushing into his veins, a warmth spreading through his chest that was more healing than any fire or drink could ever give. She did not speak, but her fingers curled faintly into his, an unspoken vow that though the path ahead was uncertain, they would not walk it alone. The prairie stretched around them, scarred but enduring, much like the hearts that now beat in fragile harmony. Caleb knew the storms were not over. Morrison's death would not silence greed, nor would one battle erase the scars of distrust. But he also knew he was no longer the hollow man who had first set foot on this land. He had been a wanderer, a shadow clinging to grief, but now he stood as something else, a protector, a man who had rediscovered not only purpose but love, love shaped in silence, in acts of mercy, in the fragile smile of a girl who had every reason to give up hope, yet chose instead to believe in him. That night, as the girls gathered once more around the fire, Caleb sat with them, his broad shoulders bowed but not broken, his eyes softened by the glow of flickering light. The eldest rested across from him, her gaze never straying, and in the hush between their heartbeats he felt the promise of a future taking root. The cabin walls, though pierced by bullets, seemed warmer now, filled not with emptiness, but with the fragile comfort of lives beginning anew. Healing was no longer a distant dream. It was here, in every breath shared, in every glance of trust, in the unspoken rhythm that bound them together. As dawn approached, painting the horizon in soft hues of rose and gold, Caleb stepped outside once more, breathing in the air heavy with ash, yet laced with the faint scent of grass returning to life. The land was scarred, but it endured. He looked back at the cabin, where laughter, faint, hesitant, yet real, drifted through the cracks of the wood. A smile touched his lips, weary but true. Love had found him not in grand gestures or promises, but in the simple act of staying, of choosing again and again to protect, to nurture, to believe. And that love, fragile yet strong, was enough to carry him into whatever tomorrow would bring. If this story touched your heart, if the warmth and the healing woven within it brought you even a little comfort, I invite you to let me know your thoughts in the comments. Share your feelings like this tale and subscribe so we may continue this journey together, building more stories of love, courage and hope beneath the endless sky.